It's an interesting thing, I think, to come to a place of celebration, a festival, a sunny field full of beautiful expressions and engagements with life, and come with the intention to speak about mortality, to speak about what it is to engage with and to contemplate this feature of our existence. And for me, it doesn't feel in any way incongruent, even if it wasn't the theme, in fact. It's one of the primary themes of the festival here, Buddhafield, this year, as you know. And when I saw the theme, I was actually quite delighted at the prospect of coming and giving some input to it, because this is an area that for me has been something of real value and power in my life and in my journey of practice, of exploring the Dharma. So, contemplating our mortality, what that might mean for us. This is something that the Buddha in his teachings invited and encouraged as a regular thing that would be of extreme value, of high value. And it's a theme that he returned to again and again in his teaching and in his encouragement to his students and followers and those people who are interested to explore what he had to offer, to engage with this wholeheartedly, to make this a central theme of one's life and one's practice. And in his own life, as I imagine many of you will know, and actually just to say, I'm aware that some of you will have actually quite a deep knowledge and maybe lifetime engagement with the territory and the teachings of the Buddha. And for others of you, this may be, just something you're interested in hearing something about and you don't know much of the context, and that I'll endeavour to sort of make it relevant in both directions so far as I can. And so far as you might feel like some of it isn't quite making sense because there isn't all the background, or there's a little bit more background than you need, just be aware that it's really quite a sort of not quite sure how. Let's say there's a lot of range of who's here. For me, actually, just before I sort of dip more deeply into the topic, something lovely to see many familiar faces here. Some of you I know really well. Some of you I've met before here or there. Some of you, of course, I'm happy to see for the first time. And part of what's here for me is not just sort of sitting down and talking about something which I can, if I'm honest, and also if I'm not careful, I can talk for hours about, and I'll try not to do that, because it's something I have interest, I have enthusiasm with regard to. But this is also a place of coming to meet, of coming to sit down. And as I was thinking about what I'm interested in being here, it's not about delivering a body of information or a bunch of stuff to you that you can kind of write down or remember or take away. That might be part of it. It is being recorded. Don't worry if there's something you thought you might like to keep. There might not be, but if there is, it will be available later. But what's important for me is that actually this is about sharing something. And something that, in a sense, is more than just what we might hear or think or conceive in relationship to the territory, but what we might also feel or sense or understand, and to just speak about mortality. It's not a casual thing. It's not just, one of those other topics that one could talk about. It's like, what is this? And in the Buddha's story, in his own life, it's very clear from what's been recorded that his own encounter with mortality was one of the primary things that led him to seek, to look, to explore his life, to see what he could discover and understand, and which really was the genesis of a journey that led to a remarkable series of unfolding understanding and sharing of teachings that have been blessed and transformative for so many people, of which I would include myself, and I'm imagining many of yourselves too. So there's this coming into contact with something, mortality, death, what that might be for us. Because, of course, in our world, there's quite a strong tendency to sort of want to tidy it up, to cover it up, to keep it a little bit on the fringes. No one's pretending it's not there, but we'd kind of like not to be reminded of it too much. That's the sort of message that goes out. That's the way it happens in the world for a lot of times. And it was really interesting to me it was, I'm trying to think now, maybe 12 or more years ago, the retreat centre, Gaia House, which Mark mentioned, and thank you for that introduction. We were offered the opportunity to be given a skeleton, a real human skeleton, and there was quite some debate about whether this was a good thing. And actually, most of us as teachers were thinking, yeah, that's really great, please, can we have this? Can we put it somewhere where everyone gets to see it? And a number of people, particularly in sort of more the organisational administration side of the organisation, were saying, oh, that might scare people off, that might make them feel uncomfortable. And it's like, actually, that kind of discomfort's really okay. That's really okay. You know, we haven't got a skeleton here to contemplate. At first glance, we might think we don't have a skeleton here to contemplate because there isn't one. But actually, there's, I don't know, several dozen skeletons here. They're just carefully concealed. We don't call them skeletons while they're still doing this. But I hope no one objects to the skeletons in the room because I'm really happy that they're here. And yet, of course, to turn towards that, to see this as something, I want to bring, I want to place in my attention, I want to invite interest and engagement with what that might mean. That's something that requires us to turn towards the fundamental vulnerability of our human condition, that we're subject to this, that mortality is part of the truth of our life. Please just come on in, find a space. So, reminders of this are not hard to find if we're paying attention, if we're looking around. So many times it happens. We hear of someone, maybe close, maybe not so close. Something has happened. I was just 2 or 3 years ago at teaching a camp that I lead every year in Dartmoor, in a field on Dartmoor for a week with about 150 people, and a couple of, or in the week or two after that camp a few years ago, we got the news, sudden and tragic, that first one participant in the camp had just died, leaving teenage daughter and ex-partner. Just gone, just like that, just gone. And then a few days later, another father of a young daughter, husband of a devoted wife, gone, just went for a walk, didn't come back, had fallen down, dead. And it's like that sometimes. It doesn't just happen at the end of a choreographed and predictable process whereby we get to say goodbye and maybe we've done our life, and we know this, of course. We know this. This isn't news to us, and yet to actually let ourselves feel that, to let ourselves open to that, this is not an easy thing for most of us. This is challenging. And so I think it's important that we enter into the territory with a sense of kindness and care, of just, what's it like for me? Not like I should contemplate this, but actually, what will allow me to really turn towards this fundamental element of my life? And not just my life, of your life, of each of our life, of every life. That, in simple terms, it's just not forever. We know that. But it's also not for sure that we get very much more of it than we've had already. This soft human body, subject to accidents, to illnesses, to aging, and inevitably to death. And yet somehow, something in us doesn't quite take that on, does it? It's interesting. We know it, and we don't quite know it. There's a lovely passage from the Indian spiritual classic, the Bhagavad-Gita, in which Krishna and Arjuna are having conversation, and Arjuna's really the sort of, you could say, the hero of the story at this point. And Krishna is this charioteer before they go into battle, and represents wisdom. And Arjuna asks Krishna, he says, with your vast vision of the universe, Krishna's a god, what do you see? What is the greatest miracle in this whole cosmos? What's the most amazing and wondrous thing? And Krishna replies, the most amazing and wondrous thing, the greatest miracle I see, is that while people see others all around them dying, they somehow believe it will not happen to themselves. And kind of just take that into notice. No, I don't disbelieve. I don't. But actually, it's not just about the ideas in our head. It's about, what is my life saying about whether I believe this? That's that's what we got to look at. That's what we've got to ask about and consider. And it is something that we struggle to fully engage with. And so one of the teachings that the Buddha gave was to contemplate this, to reflect on this, to perhaps go and sit in a charnel ground, as there were such things in that time, a place where bodies were left to rot, and to watch the bodies arriving dead, beginning to rot, becoming putrid and probably quite unpleasant to be in, to eventually become just skeletons with sinews and sort of dried up flesh, and then eventually bones, and then powder. And at each phase of this process, the Buddha's suggestion was, contemplate this, to say, this will happen to me. My body will not escape this. And it's like, at one level that sounds really kind of macabre or sort of depressing or miserable, and yet that's at a distance from it. At a distance from it, that kind of engagement or way of turning towards death, we think in our mind, and understandably, because we are somewhat attached, most of us, I think, to the being here and the continuation of our existence and the value and the meaning and the importance that it has that we're here, to somehow let ourselves touch into that takes time, takes practice, requires a courageous turning towards and an opening to whatever that evokes. There's a gravestone in a cemetery in Norfolk where there's an epitaph that was written in the 18th century that speaks beautifully as a communication really from, I guess, beyond the grave to us in this. And it goes like this. It says, "Remember, friend, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare yourself to follow me." And there's something for me, I mean, it's powerful, it's quite poetic, but it's also like, what a gift to this person in their dying, in their choice of what I will have on my gravestone when you come to visit, is this call, this invitation that says, yeah, all that were dead were once alive. All who are alive, hello, all who are alive will one day be dead. And what is it to prepare myself for that? And not necessarily just the end point of whatever we might imagine that event, so-called death, to be, but actually the fact that it's woven inextricably into the wholeness of our life. And our life that's full of curiosity and interest. And sometimes shows up in remarkable ways where we think, how would we talk about death in the context of the beauty of young life and the freshness that comes with that? And yet these may not be unconnected, it seems to me. So the fact of our death really asks us to look at our life and say, what is this? What is it to be here? What's happening that I care about, that's important for me? And of course there are many things that might distract our attention from that. It's like, why would I think about that when I can contemplate something so delightful and beautiful and easy to love as a young being? Or a not so young being, hopefully, maybe. So we are invited to reflect on this, to contemplate on a daily basis, was one of the suggestions of the Buddha, to contemplate on a daily basis. I am of the nature to age, to sicken, to decay, to die. And I like that word decay, People talk about birth, aging, sickness, death. That's the kind of standard translation. Sickness always confused me because I thought, why is that after aging? I got sick long before I got old. And then I found another word that actually is the better translation, decay. Aging, decay, death. And we hear decay and we go, oh yeah, that's a bit different, isn't it? Decay is the kind of sickness that we don't get better from. And sometime, if we're lucky, in our early 20s, we start, we hit the peak from which we start to come down. Slowly initially. It's slow to begin with. It's gentle. There's something compassionate about that. But it continues. And the arc gets steeper. And we know that, any of us who've been here more than a couple of decades. And for some of us, of course, it happens even earlier than that. So we're invited here to contemplate, to reflect on this. And one of the ways we could say, I think, that describes it very well is this sense of death. If we contemplate, if we think about it, it gives us a perspective on what's important. There's a beautiful teaching by the Don Juan, the shamanic teacher of Carlos Castaneda, recorded in the books that started with the teachings of Don Juan, that some of you may be familiar with, or where he talks about contemplating the fact of our death and seeking to ask its advice, to not turn away from it. And Don Juan says to a student, Castaneda, he says, the act of your death is never pressed far enough. The fact, of your death is never pressed far enough. It is the only wise advisor that you have. And whenever you feel that everything is going wrong and that you are about to be annihilated, turn to your death and ask if that is so. Your death will tell you that you're wrong, that nothing really matters outside of its touch. Your death will tell you, I haven't touched you yet. To ask death's advice is to drop the cursed pettiness that belongs to men and women and people of all genders who live their lives as if death will never tap them. And there's something about that, to check for the touch of death against which all else is insignificant. That sense of, the catastrophes that we have in our lives, the smaller ones and the larger ones, and of course they're not easy, and yet realizing the fear that often arises, the sense of catastrophe often suggests this will be my annihilation, this will be the end. And yet the very fact that it's happening is telling us, no, it's not that. And there's a way we can actually step back into our engagement with life and out of the fear that closes us down, that shuts us down, by remembering, oh, it's not that. It's not that. And what goes with that is that sense of to live close to our death, to live close to... And what's our death? Our death is the understanding the truth of our mortality. It's not an event that's going to happen. It's an event that's already happening. Having been born, death is happening. We just don't know when. It's not something that happens at the end. It's already happening, day by day, moment by moment, breath by breath. There is a dying of the life that was, just as there is a coming into new birth of the life that is, again and again and again. And that sense of to live close to that, as Castaneda says, to end the accursed pettiness that plagues human beings who live their life as if death will never touch them. The pettiness of so many irritations and frustrations and things that we get so entangled with, don't we? When our partner doesn't do the thing we wish they did, when our body doesn't do the thing we wish it did, or when it does the thing we wish it didn't. And sometimes it can be so annoying or embarrassing, and yet in a certain way it's, remembering actually life is still here. This vibrant, mysterious, magnificent, profound thing that we call being alive is still happening. So somehow contemplating, remembering our death helps us connect with that. And I think it brings from us a natural sense of care and capacity to resonate with others. There was an experiment that took place in a prison in Texas, so it's quite some years ago now, where the death row inmates, instead of being kept in solitary as they normally were, and Texas has a tragically high number of people incarcerated who are sentenced to death, they're normally kept in solitary confinement. That's part of what happens in that situation. And as an experiment, for a while, there was a group of them who were taken out of their solitary confinement and given a shared task to do, something not too complicated. I don't know exactly what it was. And then they were just observed how they would. And this was some quite tough, aggressive, some of them had been violent, some of them, of course, may not have been at all. Tragically, that's how it goes in the way the justice system works, but they were all there, and many of them were people who one might not have expected to sort of get on with each other. And yet it was remarkable it was observed, and this was part of what they were interested in looking, the degree of care and sensitivity and tenderness at times expressed between these incredibly tough, and they were men, tough men. And scary looking, some of them. And they asked some of them then, so what's going on here? And the response in different ways, expressed in different languages, basically come down to, we all know that each one of us is going to die. And in that knowing, of course, we relate differently to each other. They didn't say that. But that's what we might see. If we look around and realize, oh gosh, even the person who really annoys me, even the person who seems to have done that to me, which I find really hard, maybe I might relate to them differently. Or even the person I just disregard and don't think about or don't care about, it seems. If I remember that we share this, that we are, as Ajahn Buddhadasa, a much loved teacher in Thailand in the 20th century, and sort of one of my Dharma ancestors, teachers of my teachers. He said, as he would address people, he would say, hello, brothers and sisters in birth, aging, sickness and death. That sense of our shared family, our community, to bring this forth. To bring this forth. To find kindness. And that was the Buddha's response on one occasion, encountering a group of his followers who were engaged in angry confrontation and dispute. And the language is it's quite tender actually, in a sense. It says, stabbing each other with verbal daggers. And you get the feeling of, oh, they weren't doing, like wise, sensitive disputation and disagreement. It was like, this is something really painful and harmful that's going on. And his response was to ask them to contemplate, say, knowing that you will die, how can you quarrel like that? Knowing that we will die, how does that inform the way we relate to our life and to each other? So in the Buddha's life, there were these 4 heavenly messengers which we hear about, encountering someone who is ill, someone who is aging, someone who is dead, and also someone who dedicated their life to spiritual practice. The fact and the experience of contemplating our mortality is for ourselves one of the heavenly messengers that perhaps we need, or we will be served by allowing to inform our life. When I was a young man growing up in the South Island of New Zealand in a sort of rural, conservative farming community, and feeling quite out of place there, I had a dear friend. He was a simple and gentle young man, and he was a friend when I didn't often have many friends through my teenage years. We used to call him Radar because he had these big ears that stuck out sideways. And when my family went through a really difficult period where first my mother and then some years later my father kind of lost it, to put it simply, and disappeared, his family was the place where I stayed, and they were a second home for me. And in our early 20s, Radar had a simple routine surgery that went wrong, and his intestine started to die. And they took it out in sections over about 6 months. And he was still alive, but actually he didn't have any life in his body. It was kept alive by a machine. His body had shrunk, and he was being fed with a pipe going straight into his heart because all the blood vessels on his body had collapsed under the pressure of constant needles to put things in and take things out. And he decided to end it. He decided consciously that he would just not keep doing this, and he asked them to turn the machines off. He had his intestines came out the side of his stomach, his food went in there. There wasn't a long journey between the two, and that was about as much life as there was. And he died. And it really struck me in the time I was in my life. At that time, I was working in a professional office as a young barrister and solicitor in a career path that offered success, but I was finding profound unhappiness in the midst of. And I had really nothing behind me apart from this career. And I was terrified to leave it. And yet I could feel in my heart it wasn't right to do this with my life. I couldn't. There was something in my heart was dying in this success and prestige and power and money and kind of materialistically driven culture. And I wanted to leave and I couldn't. And something happened for me when Radar died, because I got this message from my friend. Not just the grief and the loss of his friendship, but the sense that his death said to me, do it now, don't wait. It's not guaranteed you'll have another chance with your life. He didn't. And he's an incredible benefactor for me and a heavenly messenger, this friend. I actually went back to New Zealand, as I have done every few years since I left almost 30 years ago, and I actually visited his family, and his mother was dying of cancer. It was something very... And I went to his grave for the first time because I left New Zealand not long after he died and began the journey which ended up with me sitting here amongst other things, my finding and exploring of the Dharma. And just for me, some very beautiful circle closing and coming back to his family and his mother, who'd just such a loving, caring, sweet, simple woman who had, just given me the caravan in the back and not questioned when I turned up for a meal. And so it's interesting for me to come back, and it's kind of strange. I sit here and it's like my whole system responds. I've talked about this and shared the story of my friend Radar certainly a dozen times, if not more, in situations like this. And yet there's something about that, of the power of that gift, of not just his life, but his death, and the wholeness of that has been so central to what happened and how my life has played out. And so one of the things it says to us is, how do you want to live your life? What is it that's important for you? Don't delay with that. Don't, because we really don't know. We really don't know what the further opportunities of our life will be. That doesn't mean we disengage from some sense of a trajectory or a longer vision of life, but do we really take care, I think, of what's here? In some of the areas we might feel important to do that is the sense of what it is to complete. To be complete with our life. To be complete with our relationships. If there are people we're close to and We haven't said to them, I love you, I forgive you, I'm sorry, or goodbye. We might get another chance to, it's true, of course, but we also might not. In my trip to New Zealand just now, I was with my father, who's 80 and doesn't seem to be very available mentally. Physically, he might go on for a while, but he could easily not be there the next time I go. And it was just interesting for me. It wasn't that I was saying goodbye, I'm not going to see you again, because I don't know that, but there was a way in which I just wanted to say to him, for all the remarkable screw-ups of his life, of which, my life somehow emerged and survived, or through which my life somehow emerged and survived, thank you. Couldn't have been other than it was, it seems. And to just really stop with that and realise, this incredibly impactful being in my life is now at this point in their journey, where they're not really able to do very much at all. And in fact, just before I went to see him, and I didn't know this had happened until I turned up in the little town and they weren't there. And then I found the reason that they hadn't answered my phone calls and hadn't contacted me by email was that there'd been a fire in their house. And his wife had pulled him out, not my mother, his third wife, but had pulled him out of the smoke. He'd been in a sort of medicated sleep and heard the alarm but not realised that it meant anything. And he could have died just there. And of course, their phone and all their records of how to contact me were gone in the fire. So I didn't even know that had happened. He could have been gone and they wouldn't have been able to tell me, because he would have gone with all the means of communication. We don't know what even happened today. It's that close. And so that sense of what it is to complete, to finish, to take care of things like this. My grandmother, who's Bengali from Calcutta in India, who I first met when I was travelling and beginning my meditation practice and exploration of the Dharma in my 20s, she turned 100 last year. And it was like this amazing thing of, I've been sort of wondering, will she be there the next time? Will she be there the next time? And then when she turned 100, it was like, this is worth celebrating. I'm going. She lives part of the time in Sweden. Her husband was Swedish, my grandfather, and part of the time in India, in Calcutta. And I went in that year to visit her in both places. Because I could tell in my heart I'd be really sad if I hadn't made that extra effort around just go and see her, be with her. It's not like we talk a lot, but there's just this sort of sweetness of a kind of love that you can have with a grandparent, which I never had contact with my grandparents, the family having moved to New Zealand from the various European places and Asian places they came from and lost contact or not kept contact. But that sense of, she looks like she could go for another 5 or 10 years, it's remarkable. And she might. But there's some sense of me having done that and really made that effort, like I feel at ease with what happened. And if I hadn't, I could tell I wouldn't. And so listening to oneself in that way, I think, is really important. One of the things we see when we actually turn towards our mortality, when we see that this is a dimension of our life, is that it reveals, it shows, and it, in a way, highlights the preciousness, the beauty, the sacredness, the blessedness of the existence that we have that's not forever. And somehow honouring that is one of the natural responses that comes. Honouring that by wanting to say, it's important to me to spend time with those people I love and care about. Or just to say, if there's someone I need to say, I'm sorry, or I forgive you, or I love you. These kinds of simple things that we say, that we sometimes don't say. And friends that I've known who, friends whose partner died a few days after the camp. They didn't get to say goodbye or the things they might have wished to say. They're left with whatever they'd managed to say already, and the younger ones, being probably around 30 with a 3-year-old daughter, wouldn't have been expecting to have to say something like that. So part of what this invites us to do, to engage with, is also, of course, what informs our life? What makes sense for my life? And the Dharma teacher, Stephen Levine, who worked a lot in the realm of death and dying, he also wrote a book and created a program called A Year to Live, which I've not done, but I've read the book. So I'm not an expert on this program at all. But the practice was to live your whole year as if you would die at the end of it, and commit to that wholeheartedly. And I think a remarkable, powerful and transformative process that many people I know have engaged in. And in the book there's a piece towards the end where he's reflecting on what he learnt through the journey that he had undertook and had guided others in. And he said in the end, and I really love this phrase, he says, in the end, the understanding was that love was the only rational act of a lifetime. And there's something about juxtaposing rationality, which we so often imagine as counterposed or contradictory to where our heart tells us our life needs to be, where love says, this is what I want to give my life to. Rationality, so, but I need to have more figures of numerals in the bank account, and I need to have more things stacked up in the attic in case I need them later, and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's important to be compassionate with those parts of ourselves that of course are afraid for our survival, and in a way trying to keep ourselves alive, and yet easily sometimes suffocating the very life that we have by the predominance we can sometimes give them. And that sense of love, to act from what we love, to speak, to express, to embody what we most care about. This is the only thing that makes sense in our life. At the end of it, as someone said, nobody lay on their deathbed wishing they'd spent more time in the office. It just doesn't happen. But I would add to that, unless what you do in your office is what you love and what you most care about, and then of course you might. But if you've spent as much time as you could engaged in that way, then that actually gives the kind of peace to one's life. There's a kind of I placed what felt most important at the centre and allowed my life to find its way to work around that, rather than somehow trying to fit that into a life that didn't quite accommodate it. So we might go to some of our reflections, our thoughts, our ideas about death. We might usefully sort of think, and some of us might have the sense of, just everything goes out. It's finished. There's nothing after that. And actually that doesn't bother me too much. As I think Woody Allen said, I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And yet we don't know that it's that, gone and nothing else. We might also say, rebirth, there's more opportunities. I can sort out all the things I didn't sort out this time around on the next round. That sounds kind of good, and yet that too, we don't know for sure what that is or if that is. Maybe it's a sort of a bit of Eastern superstition. Maybe it's exactly how it plays. We don't know. And to notice what happens if we just check, where are we with this? Do I know? Do I have a belief? Do I have a sense of it? Because it's easy from both directions. One can say, those ones who say it finishes, they're a bit sort of scientific, materialistic, sort of blah. Well, those ones who say it continues on, they're a bit spiritual, sort of wafty, sort of ungrounded, blah, blah. And yet, either way we go with a positioning here, there's something that's not true about it. Sometimes there's a sort of accusation of, it's sort of like a consolatory belief in rebirth. Well, that's only consolatory if you think life is good and fun and sweet, all the way. Because if some of it's tough, it's not that consolatory to think, I might have to do this again and again and again. That's not consolation. And likewise, we could say, well, if it actually feels like it'll be rather good not to have to do this again, then somehow death is some finite, complete ending is also consolatory. But it's not consolatory if one has a sense of some potential that is continually and ongoingly unfolding and developing and offering more, that one might have a sense of possibility with regard to. So actually, in the end, these kinds of positions are a way of taking us away from the uncomfortability of the truth that we don't know when it's going to happen for us, and we don't know at all what's going to happen when that is the time for us. When that out-breath that goes out. If you've ever done any meditation, paying attention to your breathing, I'm sure some of you will have, and that out-breath goes out, and we don't really know when the out-breath goes out, whether there's an in-breath coming in. It's that close to us. The Buddha once asked some of his students, his followers, how often do you contemplate death? And one says, I contemplate it with every day in the morning. That's all right. There's another one, I contemplate it with every meal. I said, that's not too bad. And another one, I contemplate it with every breath. And he said, that's about right. Keep it that close. And it's like, the out-breath that goes out, it doesn't come with a little sign on it that says, this is the last one. Every day, people have a last out-breath not knowing that was the last one. It's like, okay, maybe I'd be willing to stay a bit close to that, to the uncertainty, to the unknownness of this. Because this bringing us into the uncertainty, this is part of the challenge of this contemplation, to live in a condition of uncertainty, to live closer to that is more fundamentally true and real than the certainties we try and plaster on top of it to make it comfortable or predictable or have the appearance of some kind of security that in truth it does not have. When the Grenfell Tower was burning, just last year, there were people in that building, having been told to stay in their rooms, who were talking on their phones to their family down below, wondering what's happening, what's going to happen. And then, of course, at some point, the phone conversation stopped. And one just imagines what that's like, to bring ourselves into contact with, or maybe, and apologies if I'm speaking to something that's close to somebody here. It's actually close to all of us, but I mean literally in the example I'm picking up. It's sometimes useful to go close to those things that are close to us. What is that? To be that close to what happens towards the end of a life. Some years ago I heard the story of a young man, a teenage boy, I believe, who got caught on a railway track. And somehow, I don't know, the kids were playing on the track, he somehow got wedged under the track. And a train was going. This happened in the UK a few years ago. And he calls his dad and says, Dad, I'm stuck. His dad gets on the phone and says, where are you? I'm coming. The train is coming. His dad is coming. The train gets there before his dad. I don't imagine they hung up that call. How could you? And yet, what do you say in that? For a son, his dad is the person who's going to help him here. If anything, that's his function, his role, his wholeness. For a dad, his son is someone he's got to save. There's no other point in his life. And yet, it didn't happen. Couldn't happen. And just noticing, what's it like to open ourselves to this? It may not be like this for us or for ours that we love, but it might. I'm always touched by the story of a climber, mountaineer, Rob Hall from New Zealand, who I didn't know him personally, but I knew of him, and I moved a little in that world when I was there. And he was an Everest guide, and he'd taken a group up to the top some 20 years ago now. And one of his group became weak and couldn't descend, so he stayed with them, just a couple of 100 meters below the summit on Everest. And he stayed with them. He could have got down. He stayed with them. He had a wife who was pregnant at home. but he stayed with the person he'd brought up there. And as the oxygen was running out, as hypothermia was setting in, they managed to patch a phone call through from the radio telephones they had, through the phone back to New Zealand, and they spoke. And again, just to feel oneself, what is that to be there, to be in that place where you might be speaking to someone you love, knowing what's happening, and yet it hasn't quite happened yet, you know? And he said to his wife, Jan, 7 months pregnant, "Now, hi, my sweetheart." And she said, you know, "I hope you're okay," or, you know, she tried to comfort him. He said, "I love you, sleep well, please don't worry too much." And then he was gone. And she said, he sounded like, you know, Major Tom, you know, from Space Oddity, sort of like out there, gone, distant. And she said, you know, we talked about how it was impossible to be rescued from the summit ridge. You might as well be on the moon, he'd said. And something like that, to be so close in contact with someone in that place. And just to notice, well, what's that like to let that in, so far as one can? And again, it strikes me and myself because, you know, I know this story well. They weren't personal friends of mine. There's some resonance there, having been in the mountains of New Zealand where Rob was the top climber, and having been in the Himalaya where he died. But it's just another human being in one sense, and yet it's not, is it? Because it's all our story, it's all our life in a certain way. And our tendency is to turn away because it's tender, because it's not easy. And yet, our practice and our life and the teachings of the Dharma ask us to turn towards this. And that uncomfortability with the unknownness of it all, and the tenderness and the rawness of what it involves to be living and dying at the same time as we all are. Us here contemplating it, and others dancing equally. Turning towards this that death represents, because what death represents is loss, and the loss of all that we know and all that we are and all that we have. And in turning towards that and being open to it, what we also are doing is we're opening ourselves to sense into the traces of the deeper loss of our existence, the loss of our contact with the deeper and awakened nature of our life, the loss that happens when we fall asleep into unconsciousness. And we lose the sense of what is sacred and blessed and beautiful and precious as something that's living and breathing and expressed and full in the totality and the completeness of our chaotic and crazy and confused and complicated and sometimes painful and sometimes exquisitely sweet lives. And that deeper loss is part of what underlies the sense of loss being something that's so hard to bear. Because all loss lines up, all grief sort of funnels together in our hearts. And when we're touched by my story, or if one is or isn't, of things that I might have shared, it's because we know this too in our own life, even if no one we love and nothing we cared of has been lost to us at this point, if we're so fortunate. We know something of the deeper loss too, even if we're not quite fully conscious and aware of it and awake to it. Turning to this is really at the heart of the Buddha's teachings. The teaching of contemplating mortality says, open your hands, don't hold on to this. Allow it to flow through this life, allow it to flow through and see what is revealed. So much of our compelled or compulsive, conditioned and reactive behavior is a playing out of a mechanism that's somehow trying to stop us from encountering the truth of our death. And yet it's right here with us, irrespective of that. And only in turning towards us can the fruit that it offers be be tasted, be known. Because this teaching and practice is not just about contemplating death, but equally about understanding what it is that does not die, what it is that life is, beyond the forms and the shapes of tragedy and beauty that keep being expressed through it, which we can't speak to, which we can't package up in a tidy little thing and say it's this or it's that, but we equally can't say it's not this or not that, because somehow it encompasses all of it without being defined by any of it. And something in us knows of that. Something in us has been immersed in that and is, but not necessarily fully consciously now, is immersed but is not aware of it to some degree, greater or lesser. And yet is aware of it because we feel the distance as the deepest loss and pain in life, of which all other loss and pain is a reminder and a pointer to. Turning towards this, coming into contact with this. This is the profound gift and offering of contemplating our mortality. Not just how we might live our life is transformed by this, but how we understand it, how we know it, and are touched by it. Equally. So I'd like to finish with a poem by Red Hawk, a Native American elder. He says, "We have to go deeper inside, like a tired miner chipping through stone. We have to dig even when we have had enough, and it is no longer worth it to get up out of the bed. The morning is cold, the grey clouds move in low like a flock of dark crows over a picked field. That is when we have to go deeper through another hard layer of pain. You have to be relentless to make it in this place, because it will be relentless with you. It will never stop beating and grinding, wearing you down with one more thing gone wrong. Friends will die, or their nerve will fail. Women, men, others will cease to be thrilled with you. And your sorry efforts to hold it all together will come to nothing. You will still tremble in the leg, go grey and dim in the face, leak more every year in your yellowed shorts. Don't be in a hurry to pack it in. The time will come when it is easier to die than to dig. The trick is to find the gold before death finds you, and then sit there in the heart where you cannot be taken, while death storms and rages all around you, stealing everything in sight, but only left holding a bag full of bones."